All right.
Hey, everybody. I just wanted to thank you for tuning in, and I want to reiterate what Chris just said. Look, I think we can kill this bill, and I think that we should not get too fancy with our thinking and our strategy. The objective here is not to improve this bill. It can't be improved. There's nothing that's worth doing inside of it. It raises the debt, and it increases prices for everybody, all in the name of increasing or decreasing taxes for people making $4 million a year or more. So the first question, who loses their Medicaid in this bill? Look, the estimates I've seen are around 14 million people getting kicked off Medicaid. But the other thing I kind of want to point out here is that it has a big secondary effect. Even if you're not personally on Medicaid, it screws up the revenue stream, especially for rural hospitals and clinics. But any healthcare provider that has a payer mix, right? So a composition of payers that includes a big chunk of Medicaid, they're going to lose a big chunk of their revenue. And so if you're a big provider, you can probably sustain the cut. You just provide way less in the way of service to the community. But there are a bunch of, especially rural hospitals, that are always on the edge of shutting down anyway, and they will. So even if you're not on Medicaid, if you're in a place where the main hospital or clinic depends on Medicaid, you're also going to get screwed by this bill. And then the premium support problem is huge. A lot of people have no idea how much their individual healthcare plans are being subsidized. So a lot of people are going to pay like $500 more per individual per month. And if you're on a family plan, it's going to be 10 grand more a year. There's a bunch of us who remember how expensive healthcare was pre-Obamacare. And for as screwed up as our healthcare system remains, it is still a hell of a lot cheaper to go on the exchange and get some kind of plan. This will blow that up for another several million Americans. And so everybody loses for this bill, and very few people benefit. Is it possible? This is Polly from Instagram. This is a question I ask myself like almost on the daily. Is it possible to fix what Elon and Doge and Trump have done to agencies? Of course it is. Now, how quickly that can be done, I think depends on the agency. There are some agencies that can snap back to, operating in the normal fashion. I think, this is a small example, so I don't want you to think I'm only tracking this, but the U.S. Institute for Peace was basically illegally shuttered. They brought in U.S. It was nuts. It was complete, emerging autocracy stuff. They finally abided by the court order, and the U.S. Agency for Peace is starting to operate as normal. Now, they did find a bunch of drugs and drug paraphernalia all throughout the offices, so there's like a physical aspect of things being left in a shambles, but also administratively and money-wise. So I'm not like overly optimistic that it'll snap right back into working very well. But I think we have to believe enough in the American experiment to believe that once we get back to a more normal political environment, that these agencies can be fixed. Now, I just want to add one thing. The Democratic Party cannot be the party of everything is fine and everything is already working fine. So some of these agencies actually do need to modernize and reform, and we should be in on that project and leading that project. And that is sort of in opposition to let's just go in and light the place on fire. People are smart enough to know the difference, right? Between someone who wants to actually reform agencies, modernize agencies, make them work for actual people, and someone who says, government is not working as well as it should be, so why don't we make it work even less well? So, but I do think we have to articulate that we understand things are not perfect as they were 6 months ago, and commit ourselves to that kind of change, but lawful change, logical change, and a kind of an approach to things that understands that these are serious enterprises. They do serious things, and you can't light them on fire and expect them to recover. Well, please talk to us about what y'all will do to protect our government employees. One of the things that I promised myself after the second Trump inauguration is I wouldn't give you BS about where our powers are. And I actually think the tools to protect government employees are mostly in existing law. And you may or may not know that Trump has lost close to 96% of all lawsuits, and that includes a substantial portion of them that have to do with civil service and collective bargaining and other rights that our federal employees have. So most of what is happening is illegal already. We do not need a new law. We need the current law to be enforced. Okay, Katie from Instagram. Hi, Senator Schatz. How will this bill impact Native communities? It's mostly the Medicaid cuts that make me the most nervous for Native communities. But, you know, Native communities, not everyone, but many are extremely sensitive to cuts in public services. So you may not know that, especially on tribal lands, the FBI is often the primary source of law enforcement and public safety and security. So that's an aspect, but mostly it's going to be Medicaid and what that does to rural hospitals, but in particular, Indian Health Service hospitals. Anna on Instagram, how do Republicans justify increasing our spending and deficit to fund inhumane deportations versus healthcare and food for Americans and the world through USAID? They don't even bother. I mean, let's be honest, they don't bother. They're not troubled by trying to be like consistent ideologically or intellectually. This whole enterprise is very simple. They are increasing your costs, right? Your healthcare costs, your grocery costs, your retail costs, your electricity costs, right? And what are they going to do with that money? Well, they need to find a pay for, which is a fancy way of saying they need money for the purpose of cutting taxes for the wealthiest corporations that have ever existed on planet Earth and people making more than $4 million a year. So I'm not going to make their arguments for them, but I'll also say they're not even really making their arguments themselves. They're just kind of shrugging their shoulders and lying about it. And I'll take one last question and then turn it over to my dear friend, and not, although he's new to the Senate, my now mentor, Peter Welch from the state of Vermont. I'm a big fan of anyone who has, been the Senate president in a local legislature. I think that's harder than anything we do up here in the Congress. Okay, last question. What are you most angry about on this bill? It is the Medicaid cuts. Well, okay. I know you said, what am I most angry about? I'll give you two things. It's the Medicaid cuts because I just know people on Medicaid and I visit rural hospitals and I know how much this is going to crush both individuals and the institutions that serve, some of the folks that need healthcare the most. But I think the cherry on top of the sundae that makes this the absolute worst is that this money is not to pay down the deficit. This money is not for some, we're not at war trying to fight fascism and we need to find revenue everywhere we can. This isn't to reform the system. This isn't to invest in education or try to buy down the debt. This is simply to cut taxes for people making more than $4 million. And before I give it over to Peter, I just want to say, we can win this thing. This last couple of days have been pretty rocky for the Republicans. And so I don't want you to give up hope. There are some instances where I don't think we're going to win and all we can do is raise our voices and maybe sue and see what happens in the next election. This is not one of those times. We can actually win this damn thing. So I'll be back in about a half an hour to take a couple more questions. But here's Peter Welch. Come on in.